Fueled by silence and power, one human diplomat walked into the heart of a corrupt empire. Not with weapons, but with a watch on her wrist and a secret that could shake the stars. They poisoned her to keep her quiet. But before, the toxin took hold. She exposed the truth and brought an empire to its knees. This is not just a story of survival. It's the story of how one quiet voice changed the fate of a galaxy. Stay with us. This is a story you'll never forget. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. A stretch of space near the edge of the Andellan cluster, where stars blinked lazily and comets traced cold trails in the dark, a small diplomatic ship glided toward a distant orbiting station. It was barely noticeable compared to the vast spires and shimmering towers of the Vishara Citadel ahead, a structure that hung like a jeweled crown above the desert moon of Kalos. It was here, among the quiet hum of the stars and the shadow of power, that something unexpected was about to begin. Inside the ship, Leah Varen sat still, gazing at the citadel growing larger in the viewing screen. Her posture was calm, but her eyes were sharp, studying every detail. She wore a simple diplomatic uniform, gray without medals or markings, but her presence filled the small cabin like the slow rising of a storm. She wasn't famous, she wasn't loud, but those who knew her back on Earth spoke of her in hushed voices. They remembered the time she convinced 3 rival corporations to agree on a shared water treaty, with nothing but a whiteboard and an old proverb. She didn't look dangerous. She looked tired. But under that silence lived a mind that never stopped moving. Humanity had not been in the Galactic Union for long. Less than a decade had passed since their entry into the complex network of alien governments, trade councils, and ancient alliances. Most other species saw them as a novelty. A primitive race with unusual luck and stubbornness, useful sometimes but never to be taken seriously. Their bodies were soft, their histories were chaotic, and yet they survived. Again and again they found ways to adapt, to learn, to outlast. It made others nervous, especially the Navori. The Navori were one of the oldest members of the Union. Tall, silver-skinned, and covered in thick tendrils that functioned as both limbs and sensors, they moved with a grace that masked a cold ruthlessness. They controlled the mining rights to telenium, an energy-rich mineral found in only a few places in the galaxy, including the deserts of Kalos. Telenium-powered ships, cities, and even life support systems. Without it, a civilization would slow, then stop. The Navori knew this. They had built their influence like a spider builds its web, quietly, strategically, and without mercy. For years, Earth had submitted requests to access Kalos for shared mining. Every time, the answer was the same: not approved. They were offered fragments instead. Dead rocks and empty asteroids, deals dressed up with friendly language but hiding bitter truths. The human delegation had tried everything: polite discussions, policy reviews, trade swaps. Nothing worked. The last meeting had ended with a Navori diplomat saying, "You must understand, we simply cannot risk our resources on a species still learning how to organize its own planet." And so Leah had been sent. It wasn't a grand plan, it was more like a final whisper. A last attempt to talk before Earth was forced to consider other, more difficult paths. Leah hadn't been chosen for her charm or her military background. She had neither. She had been chosen because she had something rarer: patience without weakness and empathy without illusion. She saw people for what they were, not what they pretended to be. Her ship landed quietly on one of the lower docking bays. A group of Navori officials waited in silence, their long cloaks swirling in the filtered light. Leah stepped out alone, her boots tapping gently against the polished floor. The lead official stepped forward. His name was Marshal Kinhar, known for his diplomatic skill and his ability to make his enemies feel like friends, until it was too late. "Representative Varen," he said, his translator humming softly as it processed his language. "The Vishara Citadel welcomes you. We hope your journey was pleasant." Leah smiled faintly. Uneventful, which is my favorite kind. Kinhar paused. It was a simple sentence, but it held layers. He studied her for a moment before gesturing down the hallway. We've prepared a suite for you. Discussions will begin tomorrow, but tonight there is a welcoming banquet. A chance for peace, I hope. She nodded. I always hope for peace. As they walked, the walls of the citadel seemed to lean in. Everything here was designed to impress or intimidate. Crystals embedded in the architecture, lights that shifted subtly with the mood of the conversation. Even the floor tiles pulsed, faintly with energy signatures. It was like walking through the inside of a machine pretending to be a palace. Leah said nothing. She didn't comment on the beauty or the strangeness. She just kept walking, her footsteps soft but steady. Kinhar glanced at her once more, curious. Something about her didn't match the profile. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't overeager. She didn't ask questions to fill the silence. She simply observed. That night, in the privacy of her quarters, Leah stood at the wide window, staring at the red sands of Kalos below. Somewhere in those dunes were the resources her people needed. Somewhere in the halls around her were the lies keeping them away. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small watch. It was old, analog, with visible gears and hands that ticked softly in the silence. She wound it once gently and set it down on the table beside her. Let's see what time reveals, she whispered, and in the distance, stars kept blinking. The next morning, the Veshara citadel was quieter than usual. The wide marble halls lined with silver-veined stone and low-humming lights echoed with the sound of careful footsteps. Leah Varen walked calmly beside Ress, her young translator and assistant. He carried a small tablet and a nervous expression. Leah, in contrast, moved like she had all the time in the world. Her face showed nothing, but her eyes kept track of everything. The flicker of security drones near the ceiling, the sudden changes in lighting, the way every Navori staff member watched her without quite meeting her gaze. They were led through a long corridor with walls etched in alien script that glowed faintly. It was both beautiful and cold. Reese tried to break the silence. These hallways weren't shown in the layout we received, he whispered. Leah nodded, eyes fixed ahead. They want us to feel small, she replied quietly. Or lost. Maybe both. At the far end of the hall stood a pair of tall doors. They slid open without a sound, revealing a high council chamber bathed in soft blue light. Around the curved table sat 6 Navori officials, including Marshal Kinhar. His limbs rested, neatly at his sides, his silver skin gleaming like polished steel. He offered a wide smile which didn't reach his eyes. Welcome, Representative Varen, he said. We are ready to continue discussions. Leah gave a polite nod and took her seat without hesitation. Ress stood behind her, tapping a few notes into his tablet. Kinhar gestured, and the lights dimmed slightly. We've reviewed Earth's latest proposals. There are concerns, he began. What followed was hours of conversation, full of vague language and practiced politeness. The Navori spoke in circles, raising doubts, offering compliments, questioning details that had already been settled. But Leah didn't rise to their traps. She countered every attempt with quiet precision. She quoted clauses from old treaties they had forgotten. She reminded them of votes recorded in the Union archives. Each time they tried to steer the conversation away, she brought it gently but firmly back. Kinhar's smile began to strain. One of the other officials, a tall Navori named Harik, leaned forward. Surely Earth understands that Union resources must be distributed with care. We all make sacrifices. Leah tilted her head slightly. Of course. But care doesn't mean silence, and sacrifice doesn't mean exclusion. Harik's expression tightened. Ress looked between them, unsure whether to be proud or worried. By the end of the session, small cracks had begun to show. The Navori weren't used to this kind of pushback, not from humans, but Leah made no direct threats. She didn't raise her voice. She simply made it harder for them to lie. As they left the chamber, Ress whispered, "They weren't expecting that." "They never do," Leah replied. Later that evening, a formal invitation was delivered to her quarters. A ceremonial banquet would be held in the grand hall to celebrate progress and mutual understanding. Leah read the message twice, then set it down beside her watch. She stared at the small ticking device for a moment, thinking. At the banquet, the atmosphere was thick with polite smiles and hidden agendas. The grand hall was a glittering space with columns made of translucent crystal and lights suspended like frozen stars. A long table stretched through the center, set with strange utensils and decorative bowls filled with glowing liquids. Leah was placed at the center, surrounded by high-ranking Navori. Their long limbs moved gracefully, but their eyes flickered, too often. Kinhar sat directly across from her, his face a smooth mask. "Tonight," he said, "we honor the beginning of something greater." Servers moved through the hall with trays covered in silver domes. The food was colorful and unfamiliar, the smells both sweet and sharp. Leah watched each dish being placed in front of her, her expression calm. Ress stood nearby, trying to keep up with all the customs. He had read about Navori dining traditions, but the real thing was overwhelming. One of the servers leaned in. "The seventh course," he announced, "is the essence of trust, a sacred offering." He placed a crystal cup before Leah. Inside was a liquid that shimmered like oil on water, shifting colors every few seconds. Leah glanced at the others around the table. Not one of them touched their own cup. Instead, they raised them silently, waiting. Kinhar smiled again. "To unity," he said. Leah raised her glass slowly. She took a small sip. It tasted fruity at first, then bitter, almost metallic. She set the glass down gently, her face unreadable. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Conversation resumed. Music played softly, but Leah's fingers curled slightly on the table. Ress noticed. He stepped closer, pretending to adjust her chair. "Are you all right?" he whispered. She nodded once, very slightly. "I expected it." His eyes widened. "The drink?" "They couldn't resist," she said under her breath. "They want it to look like a mistake, an accident during a meal." Ress felt a chill in his chest. "We should leave." "Not yet," Leah replied, her voice calm. "I haven't finished what I came here to do." Across the table, Kinhar watched her with a fixed gaze. The others had gone quiet again, just for a moment. Something unspoken passed between them. A signal, maybe, but Leah just smiled, small and strange. The kind of smile that says, "I know more than I've said." And somewhere far above the grand hall, a tiny light on her ship blinked to life. The air in Leah's quarters felt heavier than before. She sat in a simple chair near the wide window, her hands resting calmly in her lap, but her breathing had changed. It was slower now, measured, as if her body were focusing on holding itself together. Outside, the orange and violet clouds of Kalos shifted over the desert moon's surface, casting strange shadows against the towering walls of the citadel. The poison was working, subtle, delayed, but unmistakable. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth in her chest fade into something colder. Her fingertips tingled. She didn't panic. This wasn't a surprise. In fact, she had suspected it from the moment the banquet was announced. No one offers sacred trust in a crystal cup unless they want you to drink your final mistake. Still, it had come faster than she hoped. A soft chime sounded. Someone was outside her door. She pressed a button on the armrest, and the door slid open with a quiet hum. Zura stood there, holding a tray of steaming tea and something else. Fear. The Navori chef stepped inside and set the tray down without speaking. Her eyes darted around the room before she leaned in and placed a small folded card beside the cup. Leah said nothing, only watched. Zura stepped back, paused, then turned and walked out as quickly as she had entered. Leah picked up the card and unfolded it. The message was short and written in shaky letters. They poisoned the drink. Not all of us agree. Don't trust anyone at the morning session. Stay out of the East Hall. Leah read it twice, then slid it under the tray and turned to the small desk near her bed. She opened the drawer and pulled out the old mechanical watch. She had carried it for years, a gift from someone long gone, and had always treated it like a symbol of time's quiet pressure. But it was more than that. Months before this mission, she had worked with an Earth engineer to modify it. Hidden inside its simple gears was a tiny injector, a backup antidote for biotoxins common in known Navori assassination methods. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't fully stop the poison, but it might slow it down, might give her enough time. She rolled up her sleeve and fastened the watch to her wrist. With a quiet twist of the crown, a thin needle slipped out and pierced her skin. There was a moment of sharp pain, then a deep, sudden warmth. Her heart kicked up its pace. Her vision cleared just a little, but the poison was still inside her, and it was spreading. She had to move quickly. She opened her satchel and took out a small data chip, the only copy of a file she hadn't shared with anyone yet. It was the result of weeks of quiet searching, connections made through forgotten channels and whispers picked up from sympathetic aliens across the stars. The chip contained encrypted records of Navori deals, hidden transfers of resources, forged allocation reports, and quiet threats made to weaker species. Evidence. Solid, undeniable evidence that the Navori had been manipulating the Union for years, but it meant nothing sitting in her hands. She left her room and moved through the quiet halls, using maintenance paths she had memorized from an outdated building layout. Her steps were slower now. Every breath felt like lifting a weight, but she reached the upper communications tower where she found Lorvin, the old Navori scientist who had once studied human adaptability before being pushed into silence by the council. Lorvin looked up as she entered, surprised, then worried. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, keeping his voice low. "They're watching every movement." "I'm dying," Leah replied calmly. "They made sure of that at dinner." Lorvin's expression fell. He reached forward to steady her. "Sit, please, I'll call for—" "No," she said, steadying herself. "You want change. I can give you the proof. But you have to help me send it." Lorvin hesitated. His whole life, he had worked inside the system, always careful, always quiet. But Leah's eyes, even in pain, held something that made him believe the silence had lasted too long. He took the chip from her hand, walked to the console, and inserted it. Screens lit up. Lines of data poured across them. A soft tone sounded as the files began to transfer. The communications dish turned silently, locking onto an encrypted Earth channel already hidden in the relay system. Leah leaned against the wall, her legs weakening. "Send it to the council, not just Earth. Let them see everything. Let the other species know the truth." Lorvin nodded, hands moving quickly. The files launched into the network, wrapped in layers of code that would make them impossible to ignore. "It's done," he said. Leah let out a long breath, almost a laugh. "Good. That's something." She stood there quietly for a moment, then turned and began walking back toward the lift. Lorvin called out to her, "Where are you going?" "They'll know it came from me," she said without looking back. "I want to be standing when they find out." She didn't make it all the way back to her room. Instead, she stopped in the east hallway, empty, polished, echoing with quiet footsteps that weren't hers. A group of Navori officials appeared at the far end, walking with quiet purpose. Kinhar was among them. Leah reached up and adjusted her watch one last time, and then she smiled. The sun over Kalos rose in soft gold, casting long shadows across the quiet corridors of the Vishara citadel. Inside its once busy halls, silence had taken root. What was once a place of polished surfaces and whispered power now stood in stillness, the weight of truth pressing on every wall. News of the broadcast had traveled faster than anyone expected. By the time the Navori Council gathered for their morning session, the damage was already done. Across the galaxy, species who had once accepted the Navori's dominance without question now stared in disbelief at the evidence Leah Varen had sent. It spread like fire: public records of tampered votes, falsified reports, stolen shipments of telenium. Entire colonies left in darkness while the Navori stored the mineral for their own advantage. Voices that had been quiet out of fear now began to speak. Protests rose from planets that had never known open resistance. The Unari Union Council, once slow to act, called for an emergency session within hours. At the heart of it all was Leah's name. Back in the Citadel, Kinhar stood at the edge of the Grand Hall, his hands folded behind his back. He looked calm, but his jaw was clenched. Around him, the other officials spoke in hurried whispers, some calling for containment, others for silence. But it was too late. The message was out. No amount of redirection could erase what had already been seen. Leah was no longer in the hallway where she had faced them the night before. Zura had found her minutes after they had walked away, her body still but her face peaceful. The antidote had bought her time, but not enough. She hadn't been trying to save herself. She had been buying time for the truth to escape. Ress sat beside her now in a quiet memorial chamber near the edge of the Citadel. The young assistant, once unsure and quiet, now carried a stillness that didn't come from fear. It came from understanding. He had seen her choices, seen the pain she had pushed through, and seen the purpose behind it all. On the table beside her rested the old mechanical watch, its hands frozen at the moment the message had been sent. Back on Earth, in the shining halls of the human embassy, news of Leah's final act sparked something rare: unity. Her story crossed borders and politics. She wasn't a general or a celebrity. She had been a diplomat, a quiet woman with a simple watch and a heart that refused to give up. And that somehow made the impact even greater. She had faced power not with force but with truth, and it had worked. Terran Valk, a senior member of Earth's diplomatic circle, stood before the Galactic Council only 2 days later. He had once doubted Leah, thought her methods were too slow, too soft. But now, as he addressed the room filled with representatives from every major species, his voice held only respect. He read aloud sections of her final report, shared the files she had uncovered, and demanded that mining rights be reassessed, not just for Earth, but for every planet that had been denied. Surprisingly, it was Nirae, a young Navori scholar, who stood up next. She had followed Leah's journey from the shadows of the Citadel, curious and cautious. But now she spoke firmly, asking her own people to account for their actions. Her words carried the weight of a new generation, one that refused to be silent just because the system had always been this way. The council voted. For the first time in years, the Navori no longer held control over the telenium trade. An open system was created, one where smaller colonies could finally receive the resources they needed. Transparency became more than a word. It became a rule. Zura was granted safe passage to Earth. She arrived quietly and began working in one of the embassy kitchens, far from politics, but close to the kind of peace she had once believed impossible. Ress took on a new role as a lead translator and cultural advisor. Every time he told Leah's story, he ended it with the same sentence. She never raised her voice, but she changed everything. On a quiet hill outside the human embassy, a small garden was planted. At its center stood a single silver marker with no name, only the image of a watch and an inscription that read, "Time isn't given, it's used." In the months that followed, the stars continued to shine over Kalos, but they no longer looked down on silence and fear. They watched instead as ships from all over the galaxy arrived, not to bow, not to beg, but to work together. And somewhere in that growing light, among the ashes of old systems and the seeds of something better, the memory of Leah Varen lived on. Not in monuments or speeches, but in the choices others now dared to make. She hadn't come to the Citadel to be remembered. She had come to open a door. And in doing so, she gave the galaxy a new kind of power, one built not on control, but on courage. And it all began with a simple watch, ticking quietly beneath a crystal sky.